right, and welcome to the Courtenay Turner podcast. I'm your host, Courtenay, and I'm super passionate about moving and thinking. On this show, we are going to dive into all things health, fitness, personal development, lifestyle, and political sociocultural. I've always been fascinated by people, and I love learning from the experiences and stories of others. This has been a treat for me, and I hope this is enjoyable and useful for you. As always, if you have any questions, comments, or any way that I can make this a better experience for you, please don't hesitate to reach out. Hello, welcome to the Courtenay Turner podcast. I am here today with my friend, Tom Phillips. We promised that we would return and discuss the stock market crash of 1929 and the truth behind it. So how are you doing today, Tom?
Very well, very well. Just so thrilled to finally be able to get to this one.
I'm really looking forward to this. So yeah, I think that it'll be kind of surprising and enlightening for people. So first, before we start diving into it, can you tell us a little bit about like how you came to unravel this?
Well, this really began when I was in grad school. We did a lot, because I studied both history and economics. Did a lot of discussion on, the Great Depression. And this was around the time that I was finding that a lot of things that are common knowledge are simply untrue, or at the very least, devoid of essential facts. The stories about Joseph McCarthy in America, the stories about British and American involvement in Iran, nearly everything from the 20th century, realistically, have been really short on essential facts. Facts that are crucial to our understanding of the circumstances and could severely alter the way we see those events. Oftentimes, when we talk about the 20th century, particularly in academia, it's with the absence, as if the Soviet Union and the KGB never existed. I mean, everyone knows what CIA. No matter where you go in the world, they know CIA. But it's as if the KGB never existed during the 20th century, and the Soviet Union was the most active player of world events on the world stage during that time.
Yep.
And so naturally, but in finding that so many things that had been taught were spurious, to put it mildly, I began looking at the Great Depression. I wanted to know, okay, I know the story that's there, but what am I not being told? And that really is, it goes to scientific methodology. Is to ask, what don't I know? So here's what we know. In order to get to a more deep understanding and to push it through, scientific methodology, as I say, you have to ask the question, what don't we know? Yeah. And so that's when I began looking at what really caused the stock market crash, and how the stock market crash, we're often, painting that in terms of the Great Depression itself. The Great Depression was a separate event, but that crash certainly opened the door to it. So how did that occur? And that's when all eyes pointed towards the Soviet Union. And that's where my research began. So I really dropped this. After grad school, you get busy with life and everything else. I picked it up again a few years ago because I was really planning to write a book on this specifically, but things turned in a different direction. So all of the mountains and mountains of research are simply sitting there idle at the moment. So I haven't compiled it in any intelligible form, but the information I was able to compile. And sadly, just like when I did the work on Iran and America's involvement in the Middle East, or British and American involvement in the Middle East, much of it had been hidden in plain sight. So it's not about uncovering things no one knew. It's uncovering things that it appears people wanted to hide.
Right. Yeah.
So
well, based on evidence. So based on the information that was much more abundant and more plentiful, it would seem that they wanted to hide some of the facts that lie underneath. Yeah.
And people say, oh, well, that these are minor events or whatever. Well, sometimes those minor events, they have led to the major events. For the want of a nail, as they say, for the want of a nail, the kingdom was lost. So it may seem like a minor thing initially, but look at all of the dominoes that fall into place once that little minor tile is tilted in the right way. And so once you start to uncover these things, you begin to see how they're connected. And so when I look at the 20th century, my specialty, of course, was 20th century history of the Cold War. So when I look at it, I just don't look at one country because there were so many things that were interconnected. I have to look at international events on the world stage. So, for example, something that happened in Iran might have been influenced by something happening in Moscow or London or Washington. So you can't look at these things in a vacuum. You have to look at the entire world stage. And that's what we never have done or have never been encouraged to do with the Cold War.
Yeah, no, that's so true. And I think it's so important for people to become aware of that and start looking at that, because a lot of those events were setting the stage for what we're seeing now currently. And a lot of the same things are occurring now, where we have so many different factors at play, and the arrows keep being pointed where they want us to look. And meanwhile, there's not one, there's not one target. This is a very, very intricate web of, many numerous copious actors who are involved. And, some of some of it is designed. So, yeah.
Yeah. And it really takes time. I mean, sometimes I understand we can feel as if we're just beating our heads against the wall and we're talking to no one. We're reaching no one. But, I have to believe that, as we've seen during this entire, last year and a half cycle of events, that it just takes time for people to wake up. I think people know which direction they need to go in. They just need that extra push. Thomas Paine and Common Sense, something he said that always rings true for me, said time makes more converts than reason. So it matters not that you have a more rational and logical, well thought out and lucid argument. Sometimes it just takes time.
The truth will reveal itself eventually.
Yes.
Yeah. And then it's up to those who want to see it. Yeah.
That's right. Time makes more converts than reason. So
I love that. I love that. All right. So let's start with the common notions about what happened with the crash, and then let's dive into what really happened.
Yeah, we could go with what most people know, what most people heard, that the stock market crash of 1929 was caused by greed, was caused by opulence and abundance following World War I, and it led the world into a Great Depression, and it took the actions of government, particularly in America, FDR and the New Deal, to pull America out of the Great Depression. Right. That's pretty much in a nutshell what we know about that period. And that's what's known all over the world, that no matter which country you're in, it's government that pulled the world out, but led by the American New Deal, because America's recovery led to the world recovery, so to speak. But, as I already said, the stock market crash of 29 and the Great Depression were separate, though not unrelated events.
Right. Sure. Certainly the stock market crash, weakened the economy, and it weakened the morale, which is very integral to the production of the GDP. So it's interrelated, but it wasn't a direct causal effect.
Exactly. So what you really have, and to understand what was happening, is that when the Soviet Union, we've already covered this before, that the Soviets and to socialists in general, not just the Soviet Union, socialism was to be a world embracing idea. So they were looking for the worldwide revolution. I mean, we saw a protest or a demonstration in New York recently, which a group of Marxists, BLM, Antifa, and others were actually shouting, "The only solution is communist revolution."
Yep.
Now, a worldwide communist revolution. So this is, that idea has never faded from their minds. They just, for many years, they simply weren't acknowledging it, or at least they were pretending that wasn't true.
It wasn't.
At least today, no one denies it.
Right. So I just wanted to interject with, when, what was it, 1923, where Willy Munzenberg and Antonio Gramsci had the meeting with Lenin, because they were so confused. Why isn't this revolution spreading pervasively all throughout Europe and all throughout the West? And, Antonio Gramsci was the one who said, well, because it has to be a cultural revolution. It can't just be an economic, fiscal revolution. And then the famous line that Willy Munzenberg said that will make the West so corrupt it stinks. Precisely. And off they went to Columbia University and started the Institute for Social Research. And Absolutely. Here we are today. Yeah. So not new.
From the Leninist perspective, and it was pushed even more with Stalin, subverting the social, political, and economic systems of foreign nations wasn't seen as subversion. It wasn't seen as a criminal act. Now, they did it covertly, and sometimes they would do it overtly, but it wasn't seen as anything wrong, because what they were doing, to them, it was almost a messianic quest that they were on. And so they were rescuing people from the ravages of the market environment, of bourgeois capitalism, of Judeo-Christian largesse. I mean, they were rescuing the world from that. And so when you see, I always encourage people, as difficult as it is, as unpalatable as it may seem, to at least try and understand it from their perspective, what they were achieving, what they were trying to achieve. Yeah. And so we're not talking about, some back room, cloak and dagger deals. We're talking about things that were done openly in our face. It only became more closeted after the McCarthy era, because they felt that they had to go underground. And of course, nowadays, they've come out in the open again. So it was, it was hidden for a long time. But so when we understand it from their perspective and how they saw things, to them, they weren't doing anything that was gauche. Everything they were doing was what's required to rescue the human race.
Right. Their definition of rescuing is just. I'm sorry, say that again.
Even if it leaves a pile of dead bodies behind them. So.
Minor details. Yes. So tell us what did happen? What really happened that led to?
Well, to understand what was happening, we have to understand how the Soviets planned this. These things were planned out by socialists. Leading from the Soviet Union, the socialists around the world played a part in it.
Yeah.
The Soviet Union tried this tactic because nearly everything they ever did, they had to first test it. And so the tactic was actually tried in Iran. After the Bolshevik Revolution, the Soviet Union essentially set to tearing apart what was of the Iranian government. Right. One of the things they did was they got control of the Iranian economy by signing economic deals. The Soviet Union was very good at signing economic deals, what they would often call friendship pacts, which made the other nations pretty much colonial possessions of the Soviet Union. And so they signed an economic treaty with Iran that gave the Soviets most favored nation status in economy and trade. And so the Soviet Union, the biggest trade, most of the world was still agrarian at the time. And so they used that ability to gain control of Iranian trade in agricultural goods, particularly in grain, which the Soviet Union had in abundance. Right. Over time, the Soviet Union got total control. And then what they began to do was take their grain off the market. When you take the grain off the market, naturally the prices go up because now you have less supply. So this will be a lesson in economics for some people as well. And so as you take the grain off the market,
people should take note about what's happening currently with the supply chain disruptions. Yeah.
That's right.
This is why we study history. Yes, go on.
And so they took the grain off the market, prices began to rise. So Iranian merchants and farmers were actually doing quite well because they were able to fetch higher prices for grain. They were able to get to buy more equipment, secure deals with foreign suppliers, foreign governments for their produce.
Yeah.
Once they got locked into these long-term deals, well, the Soviet did something that was very horrible. They simply dumped their grain back on the market. And what did that do with the prices? It caused prices to collapse. Iranian farmers were now indebted to their contractors
Of course.
based on prices that were no longer available and no longer possible. And so from that, the Soviet Union realized that they could crash an economy, but if they could do it that way, what could they do on a larger scale? So they began to manipulate, and it wasn't just Soviets. The Soviets had a lot of help, primarily from British and American and other European intellectuals, economists, and the like. So they understood how these markets work. They understood very well. The Soviets may not have, the Russians may not have, but the people they hired definitely did.
Yeah.
And what they did is they began to manipulate the world grain markets and commodities markets, which was one of the largest markets in the world for international markets, that is. They were manipulating it. And so a lot of people, when the Soviet Union began to take its own grain off the market, no one really questioned that. No one thought about it because, the line is, well, the Soviets are going through hard times. They need to feed their people. They're trying to reorganize their economy and get the home front together. So no one thought about what they could be doing. But what was happening on the American stage? Well, American farmers were doing quite well during that time.
Right.
They were able to secure extremely attractive loans. They were buying very expensive equipment, secured by their farms, of course. So the banks, there was a lot of money floating around. And as we see, all economic areas are interconnected. So as the commodities market increased, grain markets increased, other areas of the economy also increased. And so people became somewhat overextended. There was a sort of euphoria, almost as we can see, that happened during the run-up to the 2008 real estate crisis, where for about 10 years there was a sort of euphoria that it will always go up. It's always going up, and we'll never be down again. Well, we know that isn't realistic. And so
the laws of gravity should teach people a little bit about that, but
Precisely. Well, in 1929, what the Soviets did, and of course Stalin was in power now, Stalin simply orchestrated the dumping of Soviet grain back onto the market.
Yeah.
So what do you think happened to commodities prices? Well, the problem is that everything started to tumble. People were locked into long-term deals, including loans, secured by their farms. Farmers were losing their farms. People were losing hand over fist, and stocks began to tumble. By October, it was a precipitous decline. And then, of course, October 29, everything fell. The bottom fell out, and the market completely collapsed. Now, that was the stock market itself collapsing.
Yeah.
But the Soviets were not done. They realized what they could accomplish, but they were not done because the market actually began to recover. The U.S. economy began to recover within about 6 months, in fact. So
very resilient, the U.S. economy. Yeah,
exactly.
If left alone, it tends to prove that it's quite resilient. Yes.
Exactly. So initially, people did suffer. I mean, people suffered to the point where there were people who were committing suicide because they had lost everything, and they didn't see the light at the end of the tunnel. But after about 6 months, the recovery began.
Yeah.
But you had another problem on the stage, and that is FDR. The Democrats were able to paint the stock market crash as a failure of Herbert Hoover.
Right.
Now, the arguments for that were spurious, but that being said, it's just the way it is, and people believed it. But they were able to turn that into a major victory at the polls. And so Democrats came into power, FDR came into power, and FDR used the Great Depression to push through some radical changes in US law. I mean, changes that came very close, dangerously close to completely obliterating the Constitution itself. We
Yep.
know what those changes did to the 10th Amendment, and that is they completely pierced the wall that separated federal and state authority.
Yeah.
So this is how we got to the Great Depression.
Yeah. I would actually add that there's probably, they laid the foundation with the, 1913, the Federal Reserve.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
All of those things were necessary. Those were a necessary component in what they achieved in the 1930s.
Yeah.
So switching to the Keynesian economic model, getting rid of the gold standard, creating fiat currencies, all of those things, those were necessary components. That was the groundwork that had to be laid in order to get to what they were seeking to achieve in the 1930s.
Right, right. And so, as you were saying before about how there's not one player involved, certainly the Soviets were interested in a one world government. But they wanted to be the rulers of it. And we had other players, certainly in Great Britain, and, other consortiums, if you will, who were vying for a new world order. I mean, they were talking about this, Wilson was talking about it back in the early 1900s. So it's not new. I think a lot of people are thinking this is a new term, but we've heard of this for over a century. So this has been in the works, this new world order. But I think that the myth is that it's, one that wants to, yes, they want a one world government, but there's a lot of competing forces who want to be the rulers of that one world government. Right. And sometimes they play, I'm sorry?
Oh, that's a fact when it comes to socialism in general. There are many schools of socialism who will work in tandem to achieve the primary goal of destroying the bourgeois models, as they say. But that doesn't mean that they're friends. That doesn't mean that they're,
right.
that they're eternal allies. In fact, there are many. The socialist movement itself is rife with disagreements, and disagreements not just over policy but over who it's going to control.
Right.
So the Germans were socialists, the Italians were socialists, the British were socialists, but they didn't see themselves as being puppets of the Soviet Union.
Right.
Then why should Stalin rule the world? I want to rule the world.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that that's just it. They, people are fooled into thinking that just because they play nice with each other, which they do because they think that, if they serve their competition, they can possibly beat out their enemy and be the ruler. And I think we're witnessing a lot of that on the world stage today. We've got the UN players, the WEF players who are, really part of the UN agenda as well. But then we've got, China who plays nice with them, but don't think that they don't want to be on their own and, be the top dog. And we're seeing now what's happening with Russia and Ukraine. And so there's a lot of intricacies. And I think that it's really important for people to understand that it's an intricate web, and that, socialism, they all have the same goal, but that doesn't mean that they're comfortable with somebody else being the winner of that achievement.
A lot of it is there's an expression. It comes from America, and it comes out of the same period. The expression is Baptist bootlegging. Now, it may sound a little pejorative, but Baptist bootlegging, where you have two groups who want to achieve the same thing, but for completely different purposes. One of those groups, can do it publicly. The other group, well, people may be turned off by them, so they have to do it behind the scenes. So the way you achieve a common goal is the group that has to work behind the scenes finances the other group because it's a better face for the movement. It makes the movement look better. So, for example, the Baptist bootlegger argument comes out of the run-up to the 19th Amendment, which abolished alcohol. You had people who were making illegal alcohol, moonshiners,
Right.
and they were doing good business.
Yeah.
And so they obviously saw that, look, they saw that there was a movement among certain Christian groups to ban alcohol. It was led by the women's movement of the time, the suffrage movement. It was one of their causes, because they saw alcohol as being the reason for abuse and abuse of women and that sort. And I'm not saying that they were wrong,
Right.
but they turned it into a major political movement against alcohol. And why not ban alcohol? Well, there again, how I say, but for a nail, these little small things can become big things. And that little argument, when infused with the financial backing of the underworld, the bootleggers, led to a major political movement and an amendment to the Constitution, which is not an easy thing to do. They amended the Constitution to ban alcohol. And naturally, we know what that led to. It led to a growth in organized crime, the Al Capones, and of course the Kennedys and some others. But it led to a groundswell in organized crime,
Right.
all because bootleggers decided to ride on the coattails of what we now call Baptists, the Christians. Hence the term Baptist bootleggers. So a lot of that
Right.
happens in political movements today. I mean, the environmental movement was spurred into action in the 1960s and 1970s by money infused to them through OPEC. Now, I'm not saying that they knew that money was coming from OPEC,
Right.
but the fact is, OPEC was financing environmentalist movements that were agitating against domestic oil production. Now, why would OPEC want to do that? Because OPEC, if you cut off domestic oil production, then you're going to have to get that oil from somewhere else. And that
Right.
became OPEC. So this is just economics 101. I mean,
Most people haven't taken that.
We call it Baptist bootlegging. So there again, OPEC could ride on the coattails of the environmentalists. Environmentalists, they look good publicly, but if you're an oil company, you can't come out, you can't stand in front of that argument and say, well, this is the reason why we want you to cut your oil. No, you just hide behind someone else who has a much more attractive argument.
Yeah, exactly, and hide behind that, because that's a much better marketing ploy than if they were to be transparent. I think I just posted about Red Lake 40, which is food dye that's in everything, and it's petroleum. That's what it is.
That's true.
Why are the environmentalists not outraged by this? Why do we not see like an uprising? We're putting oil into petroleum into all of our foods. Shouldn't we be stopping all of this production? This is devastating the environment, isn't it? I think it's devastating some intestinal linings, but that doesn't seem to be a concern.
It is. Well, they pick the battles that they know are more easily digestible. So
right.
Despite their claims to be more intelligent, more enlightened, and that sort. Let's face it, any major public movement is designed to appeal to the least common denominator, to the least, to the people who are more driven by emotional responses rather than intellectual
right. Yes.
arguments.
That's a much wider audience, and it's a much easier sell.
That's right. It takes longer to convince people that way. So appeal to their emotions instead. It's much easier.
Right. Great. And here we are. So back to the crash of 1929. Can you point to some other, I think people are much more, we talked about this, I think last time a little bit, we touched on this, people are much more awake to the possibility that the market is not such a free market. And, there are some controls involved. And so what are some other
the idea behind these markets in general, corporations and the like. One of the things that we did, and this is why I say these small things that people tend to overlook historically. A few years ago, it was probably, I'm going to say 6 or 7 years ago, the Supreme Court
Mhm.
made a decision that drove the political left crazy. They say the Supreme Court, basically, imbued corporations with personhood, say the corporations were persons. That is simply not true.
Right.
That decision was made back in the 19th century and was a lot of part of the 19th century. All the Supreme Court did was simply recognize that for tax purposes. Now, why would the court do that? It had nothing to do with granting corporations special privileges or anything else. In fact, it stripped from corporations a privilege.
Mhm.
One of the benefits of the corporate structure was limited liability. And so if you could hide behind the corporate veil, then you could do whatever you want and no one could sue you.
Right.
But the problem is you couldn't sue the corporation either because corporations were not people and you could only sue a person in court. So you had to have standing to sue and that other person could not be represented. So what the courts did is they simply said, well, from henceforth, corporations have to be viewed as individual people. They have to have their own individual counsel. So corporations, for the purpose of tort litigation, were now viewed as people, and that allowed people harmed by corporate activity to actually sue the corporation, because you couldn't sue the owners; they hide behind the corporate veil.
Right.
So now you can sue the corporation. When it came time to talk about taxes and how you were going to tax, well, that made it very attractive to the political left, because now if corporations were people, then they also had to pay an individual income tax. And that's what led to the idea of double taxation. Corporate profits are taxed as an individual, and then when the money is paid out, it's taxed again. And so, like I said, sometimes an argument may sound really attractive initially, but when you look at the other things connected to it, now it really isn't so great. It only sounded great before. And so the problem is, and so you had corporations that were now doing a lot of business in the early part of the 20th century.
Right.
And the people found it attractive to be, to own stocks. It was a great way to move, to build your portfolios and the like. I mean, there's certain places that became extremely wealthy, certain towns or whatever, because they traded stocks. But trading in stocks was something that was very attractive. And American corporations were doing some of the biggest business in the world. The American Stock Exchange was the most prolific in the world. Which is why we end up talking about America so much when we talk about this period, because this is where the activity was. It eventually reached the rest of the world, but this is really where most of the activity was. I mean, the London Exchange was big, but the London Exchange was primarily in the commodities market and gold. And the price of gold is still set at the London Exchange, but other, individual stocks and that sort were primarily, the American markets were more attractive in that way. And so the number of people who were invested, so to speak, were pretty large. And the amounts of money as well. And banks, of course, banks were also investing that money. So when the market began to tumble, it was a ripple effect throughout the economy. I mean, you didn't have the luxury of saying, well, I'm not invested in the grain market, so I won't be affected. All of these things were connected. All of these things were interconnected. So when one fell, they all fell. It's sort of like today, if you manipulate the price of oil, you're going to affect everything else in the economy, because everything is based on oil. And your goods have to be transported.
Everything.
And transportation costs money.
Yeah. Even our very quote unquote green energy products are, some of them are the biggest oil consumers.
Precisely. Precisely. So, that's one of the reasons why the crash of 29 was so devastating, because it completely wiped out the livelihoods of millions of people, not just in America, but around the world. And you had farmers, and back then, farming was one of the biggest industries.
Of course.
And if your farm went under, banks were foreclosing on properties and the like, because they were trying to survive as well. Everything was crumbling. people had these loans, and now the grain market, just the bottom fell out. There again, if you remember 2008, and most of us do, um, you know, that's the closest approximation we could get, where something was going up and up and up, and then everyone, all these livelihoods were tied to this increase.
Right.
In California, you had the tech bubble of the 1990s, and you had a governor in the state at the time, Gray Davis, who contractually committed California taxpayers to long-term deals with the Public Employees Union, CalPERS, and it's guaranteed pensions and all of this other money based on the money that was flowing from the tech industry, with the assumption that this would always continue. And of course, when it fell out, taxpayers were still obligated to pay those amounts, but the money wasn't flowing in the way it had before. And so California has struggled economically ever since. And that's the problem when we try to base long-term decisions on something that is really more temporal and short-term.
Yeah.
It's a problem with politics, because politicians don't plan for the long term; they plan for short term. And so, your idea is to get elected and stay popular. And so, what people can see today, you're not going to talk about what happens 50 years from now. You have to base it on what happens today. That's the life of being a politician. But as economists, we have to look a bit further than that.
Yeah. Well, I would argue that a lot of politicians actually really do look much further ahead. They play, that's really their strategy. But yes, in terms of getting elected, the platform that they profess and that they, claim to care about is much more short term, but that's their appeal to, the voters is the short term. But I think what they're actually laying out in terms of their policies is really a long-term strategy.
That's right. I mean, that's what FDR did with the New Deal. Much of the New Deal policies were struck down by the Supreme Court, of course, but they continued to envelop them in this piece of legislation, that piece of legislation. But all of these things led to the NRA, the National Recovery Act. And because of the activities of the government during the 1930s, it caused capital and investment to stifle.
Yeah.
You see, economies exist, or at least free economies exist, on the basis of two things: profit and loss. I don't say profit or loss, I say profit and loss. You need both. Yeah. You need profits to incentivize risk, but you need losses to incentivize prudence. If you try to control either of those factors, you'll destroy the entire system. So if you try to control how much profit people can make, then you're going to cause those people to not take risks or to take irrational risks. And if you try to control losses, you get the same thing. So you need to have the presence of both unfettered.
Yep. The term is just to find risk homeostasis, right? Just like the body is always trying to find its balance and its alignment. If we didn't have the risk homeostasis that you're constantly seeking, then people would, risk everything, and it would be completely reckless, or they would be the opposite. They'd be so prudent that there's no potential for growth. So, yeah.
Precisely. So you need both. You need people to take risks, but you need them to be accountable for the risks they take. And that is, you need those people to assume the losses when there are losses. But governments get elected, they stay in power by indemnifying people against loss and almost encouraging people to take then irrational risks. Right. And saying, well, if you lose, then there's a safety net, and we'll protect you. And so with the economy, with what FDR and the socialists were doing in the 1930s, is they were systematically destroying not just the market itself, but the psychological framework that held the market together. The very thing, the foundation that created the market, that's what they were eroding. I'm not saying that all of them knew this, all of them thought about it in this way, although quite a few did. The fact is, this is what was happening. in their quest to achieve this better world that they were going for. And so gradually they caused markets, they caused investment that was starting to recover, by the way, to retreat. And so people stopped investing. People stopped putting their money where that money could do best. And so the US economy shrank. And naturally, with the shrinking economy, no investment, no job growth, no economic growth. Well, that sent ripple effects throughout the economy. And and it began as a recession and it became a depression. And that didn't grow out. People say, well, FDR, it was the World War II that saved the world from the economic malaise of the Great Depression. Actually, it was simply because things like the NRA were completely gutted by the Supreme Court. The NRA, the final nail in the coffin for the NRA, if you're familiar, there's a Mona Sharon, not Mona Sharon, I'm sorry, it's Amity Shlaes. Her book, The Forgotten Man, and by the way, I know The Forgotten Man, just to put this out there, most people hear that expression, The Forgotten Man, and they relate it to FDR because FDR used that expression many times, but FDR did not originate that. FDR was quoting a Yale professor. I can't remember his name now, but he wrote a poem called The Forgotten Man. Mm-hmm. It was a beautifully well-written poem about policy and economics. And, FDR, I think FDR was quoting him, although
I don't remember his name either, but I remember the poem. Yeah.
Right. So people now think that was FDR's statement, and it actually wasn't. But the thing about The Forgotten Man, or Amity Shlaes, she was the first to tell the Schechter case, and the Schechter case is for in economics. It is like the modern Madison, Brown versus Board of Education, Roe v. Wade of legal cases, because it was a milestone. It completely destroyed the NRA, the National Recovery Act, and by destroying that pulled everyone out of the Great Depression. And just to give you a little background of the Schechters, they were a couple who had a chicken business. Older Jewish couple, and in the Jewish community, chicken business is very important in kosher meals and that sort. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that the government tried to do was control the chicken industry, and how chickens are sold, how they're marketed, and they tried to control everything about the business. But you have to understand that in the kosher community, they had their own rules, own standards. And so the government came up and they wanted to use the Schechters as an example of everything that was wrong with these independent actors. And the Schechters fought the case. They also had a lawyer who was not well known. The government had these lawyers from Yale and Harvard and all of that. And the Schechters had this local rabbinical lawyer. He wasn't like those guys, but he knew what he was saying. And they fought this case before the Supreme Court. And the brilliance is, while the government did everything, the things that the government said about them today, you could never get away with doing those things today because you'd be called anti-Semite and a racist and everything else. And quite frankly, they were. But the things they did about the Schechters, did to the Schechters and tried to do, and they stood their ground. They stood up and defended themselves, and they won the case. Again, in front of the Supreme Court, who probably had they couldn't relate to this small family business, sure, but they related to the Constitution. And that was one of the things that signaled the death knell of the New Deal and those policies. Now, granted, the Democrats did eventually achieve nearly everything they wanted.
I was going to ask about that. Okay, yeah.
They achieved it incrementally through, there was more the social democratic Fabian model.
Yeah.
They did achieve those things they've had, but as a full, complete package, it was gutted by the Supreme Court. And that is the brilliance. So anyone, if you really want to understand more about the economic history of America, I would say add the Schecters to your understanding. And Amity Schloss's book probably was the best sort of summation of what happened during that period. And she was the first, I think, that I've come across that I actually, highlighted the Schechter case. But in economic history, it is a landmark decision because it speaks volumes. But those were the things that brought us out of depression. It wasn't the war. It wasn't FDR's policies are what turned a mild recession into a depression. So when we understand how economies work and how how psychologically impactful it can be when you stifle investment, then you understand why a recession became a depression.
Right.
And we've been able to avoid that cycle since then because, economically, we know how those things happen. We get recessions from time to time, but the reason, even the 2008 debacle, which affected, all around the world, that could have been, had we not had a better understanding of economics, that could have turned into a worldwide depression. It was devastating and it was very painful for about a year or so, but it didn't turn into a worldwide depression because we understand better how these things work.
Mm-hmm.
But the problem is with understanding is that there are people who use that to their advantage. And so they know how, and so they simply learn better ways to manipulate markets and manipulate industries. But the Great Depression itself was created by government. It was created when governments use public policy to achieve purposes that are contrary to the public interest. That's when we get depressions, economically or otherwise. And, I have to say that, look around the world, look at here in America, and you see some of that happening right now.
Yes. So that brings me to my next question. So it was intentional that they were trying to crash the market.
Yes.
And I'm curious your thoughts on it. Do you think that the intention was because I think we're seeing some of this right now. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on that. But do you think it was intentional to really destroy the American economy? Because America is kind of the thorn in the side for the New World Order, one world government.
Of course it was. And there again, remember I said earlier that the Soviets were not done. They were not done manipulating the grain market. The Soviets' biggest commodity was grain.
Yeah.
So one of the things that Stalin had to, in order to truly repeat, or control the effects that he could have on international commodities markets, he had to completely control all grain and all farming throughout the region. Yeah. So the things most of us have heard about, instance, the massacre, the Ukrainian famine. But there again,
sorry, say that again. You cut out for a second. So say that once more.
Yeah. Ukrainian massacre and Ukrainian famine. Most people have heard about that.
Yep.
But when we talk about these historical events, there again, we talk about them as if we talk about it in a vacuum, as if they're completely separate events.
Right.
But the Ukrainian disaster was connected to this.
Yep.
One of the things that Stalin had to do was control grain, and that meant getting control of Ukraine, because Ukraine that was Russia's bread bowl. That's where all of the grain was grown.
The bread basket.
It was the same thing in Iran. It was all grown in the northern part of Azerbaijan. So, of course, the Soviets wanted to control Azerbaijan, which they managed to do for a limited time during World War II. But the idea was to get control of the grain. And so that meant basically controlling getting control of those farms, these independent farms. You have to bring them under government control, centralized control. Well, the Ukrainians resisted. Mm-hmm. And Stalin didn't take kindly to people who didn't obey him blindly, much like socialists do today. And so to him, it was conform or die, much like socialists believe today. And so the Ukrainians had no choice. They resisted. Stalin basically murdered millions The numbers differ. Who knows how many? It could be, I've heard numbers as much as 10, as low as 10 million, as high as 30 million. Who knows what the actual numbers are?
When
Because,
you're quibbling over tens of millions, does it really matter?
right,
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
100 people would have been, a massacre to me. But the fact is, he killed millions of people in order
Yeah.
to get control of that market.
Right.
And if you're familiar with George Orwell was, he was a very well-known writer of the early 20th century, the author of 1984. But he was writing a piece at the time, Animal Farm. An
Mm.
Animal Farm, because the world became aware of what Stalin was doing a bit too late, but they became aware. I think that many people in America, including in the FDR administration, if you know the history of America, you know that many of them knew exactly what was happening in Ukraine, but people pretended not to know.
Right.
And Animal Farm became more or less a story about the Ukraine massacre in an indirect way. So the
Right.
next time you decide to pick up Animal Farm and read it with the understanding that he was writing that in light of what had been revealed from Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
One of the people who helped push that story and get that story out there was William Randolph Hearst. William Randolph Hearst was the most powerful media mogul at the time. His media empire was massive. FDR hated the man, Stalin hated the man, and he hated both back. Well, FDR turned the powers of government. He often would use the powers of government against people who he considered enemies, and William Randolph Hearst was one. And so he basically tore apart Hearst's entire empire. Hearst, right now, tourists in California, I'm one of them, who's had the pleasure of visiting Hearst Castle. But when you understand how that became a public property, it's actually very sad because you had a federal government turn its guns against a private citizen because that private citizen had outed information about a foreign power that federal government considered its friend. And because Hearst used his media empire to make the world aware of the Ukrainian massacre, FDR responded by destroying him. But it wasn't just Hearst. He destroyed a lot of people. But the Hearst situation is ultra sad when we have all, so many of us have visited the Hearst property and we love the house.
We did. Yeah.
But it only exists because the government basically destroyed the man.
Wow. And I think that is so apropos to bring to light today, because we're seeing all these political prisoners who are being targeted solely because they are bringing some facts to light.
Exactly.
And
that's the reality. German philosopher Franz Werfel, something he said, and it rings true to me always. He said, "Look, to those who believe, to those who do not believe, no explanation is possible. For those who do, no explanation is necessary." And so, hope against hope. We're still trying to talk to those who don't believe. But I think Werfel was right. No explanation is ever possible to convince them because they've already been convinced through the power of their heart and mind that they're right. And so they can look at what happened during this period to the Schechters, to the Hursts, and to all of these other individuals throughout history, and they see it. Well, those were the growing pains of a new nation. Those were, if you, as they say, as socialists used to always say, you can't make an omelet without cracking a few eggs.
Right. Isn't that what Stalin said? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So it became a very popular saying among socialists, but they still believe that today.
They do.
And that is the sad reality. So the next time you think about the Great Depression, think about all of the other things that were connected to it. The Ukrainian massacre, the worldwide control of grain and manipulation of the grain markets. Today, it's turned into worldwide manipulation of the oil markets. Back then, it was grain. The oil industry, oil was not the commodity it is today. But, so just replace, grain with oil, and we're repeating the exact same thing.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question to you, actually, is what do you, not that I think you have a crystal ball, but based on your knowledge of history and knowledge of the markets, what do you think is the likelihood of what do you think is likely to happen moving forward? Because we are seeing some market downturns, and we are certainly seeing supply chain disruption. And we do know, the phrase build back better. The part they don't say is you have to tear it down to build it back better. So we know that their goal is to tear down the American economy, and specifically, they're targeting all of the West, but specifically the American economy for the reasons you
You target the American economy because, let's face it, like it or not, this is the driving force of world economies.
Yeah.
And so what tends to happen in America economically happens to the rest of the world. There are only 4 exchanges to really pay attention to if you're looking at international events. You're going to look at the Tokyo Exchange, you're going to look at the Frankfurt Exchange, the London Exchange, and the New York Exchange. Those are the only 4 that really matter in the world, because they drive the rest of the world. And so the players, America, are on those 4.
Mm-hmm.
That's where all the business is done. Yeah. What I think they would like to do, yeah. I think that they need to this idea of doing it for a green future and that sort. Again, we've mentioned before how the entire green movement, the environmental movement, is just a communist movement with a different name. They no longer hide that. For many years, they were hiding that fact, but unfortunately, it's no longer hidden. We know it. But that's where the
and it's worth noting, I think we did mention this before, but that movement really exploded from the Club of Rome document, which was the limits of growth in the 90s. And we know the Club of Rome is just part of the globalist agenda. They're one of the globalist groups who are trying to force the New World Order. So
yeah. Absolutely. And so, these people, they are globalists. They have been, since time immemorial. I mean, the French Revolution was never supposed to be limited to France. The French Revolution was supposed to be was supposed to start the worldwide sort of conversion to the idea. Of course, it fizzled out. Well, they had many revolutions after that, but, they never seemed to get it going. The Bolshevik Revolution was the one that really got things moving forward. Largely on the heels of other changes that were made in Western economies, like Keynesian economics and the gold, switching away from the gold standard and that sort of thing. Right. So the Bolshevik Revolution really sort of moved things forward. And even though the Soviet Union collapsed, the ideals of the Soviet Union remain, because most of the people in government today, these were the people who had always viewed the Soviet Union as the ideal form of government. They always felt that way. Now, they may not have wanted to be ruled by, the Soviet bosses, the Politburo and the KGB, but they saw that form of government as the best form of government for the human race. And these people are in political power now. They came to power while most of us, or most of the human race, were sleeping, despite the fact that many of us kept banging on the door and saying, wake up. The fact is, they're in power now. So what do I think will happen in the future? I believe that, the fact is, once people are in power, they don't easily give it up. Dictators tend not to go without a firing squad. I mean, that's the reality. There's only, one piece of evidence, one data point of a dictator who willingly gave up power, Augusto Pinochet. And he was a dictator only in the most liberal sense of that word. Augusto Pinochet came to power with the promise to rid Chile of the influences of Soviets, of socialism in general. And he said that his program will take approximately 10 years, and when he achieved his purposes, he will step down. Well, he kept his word. He stepped down after 10 years. So that is really the only data point that I'm aware of. Perhaps there may be others, I'm not aware of them, of a supposed dictator who willingly gave up power. But generally speaking, dictators don't give up power unless they're carried out on in a morgue. I mean, it just doesn't really happen that way. And right now, they have established an international socialist dictatorship. And they are doing the sorts of things that we have gone to war to prevent. I mean, you look at the things that are happening in certain countries, I don't have to mention them by name, and it is shocking and appalling what they are achieving. And these are the things we went to war to prevent. We
Yep.
went to war to end this sort of thing.
Yeah.
We lost millions and millions of lives to end these things. And now there are people who are clamoring for it. They're demanding it. And
It's
so we've simply forgotten history. And that's the reason why I always talk about history, because if we don't talk about it, if we don't understand our past, then that past becomes our future. That's
yeah.
the danger.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, it is really astounding when you look at some of the things that are happening. And I mean, it's astounding anywhere that it's happening, but some of the places that it's happening, it's like, how did you forget? It wasn't that long ago.
That's right.
And I mean, there are people alive to talk about those
Right.
incidents. So yeah, it's really, and how you're not seeing how you're not connecting the dots and seeing the parallels.
Well,
So
there's so many people there again. I think there's a sense that people just want to get on with their lives. They just want to
Mhm,
live an easy life, a comfortable
mhm.
life. Um, and so to them, they would much rather bury their heads in the sand and say, okay, I'm not going to think about it. It's troubling, it's depressing, but hopefully it'll just pass and I won't think about it. Um,
Well,
there's a line from
ignorance is only bliss until reality smacks you in the face.
precisely.
Yeah.
Precisely. One of my favorite passages from the Talmud. It says, "You are not required to finish the work, but neither are you free to abstain from it."
Yeah.
You know, it may
Yeah.
not all be on your shoulders, but you don't have the luxury of simply ignoring it.
Right.
You have
Yeah.
to do your part. And so, if you want to keep humanity safe, I think we all have a job to do. We all have a part to play in that. We
Yeah.
can't simply sit back and rely on our neighbor to do it for us and say, they'll take care of it and I'll enjoy the benefits. This is an externality that affects everyone. Externalities in economics are those things that you can't tie to one person. It's like saying, I can't breathe your air. Air belongs to all of us. And so if I make the air dirty, it affects you, me, and everyone else. And
Yeah.
that's the thing, guys. So freedom, human freedom, is an externality. Lose it one place, and you lose it everywhere.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, for sure. I'm curious about with the markets right now because we do have the supply chain disruption that a lot of evidence indicates are being intentionally manipulated.
There's no question about it. Yeah.
Yeah. So, what are some things we can do to buffer against? Because we're already seeing major inflation.
Yes.
No matter how much they want to pull the wool over your eyes, it's really anybody who has bought anything in the past 2 years can't deny the inflation that we're seeing. And
The biggest cause of the inflation right now began with manipulation of the oil markets. Because
Mhm.
once you increase the price of doing business and the cost of doing business, which is transportation, because things have to be moved around. Once you increase the cost of doing business, then those costs are passed on to everyone else, all the way down the chain.
Right.
And so we're seeing these prices increase. And so the government talks about the difficult for families and that sort of thing, although there are certain individuals in this current federal administration in America who have actually laughed about the impact that this has had on families. But they're doing this deliberately because they want to achieve something that has nothing to do. They'll couch it in terms of public health and that sort of thing and say it's because of the pandemic or whatever. But the things that they're doing have nothing to do with that. And all it really takes is a little bit of common sense to see it. But they've manipulated the oil markets. And so the only way to get out of this is to, one thing you have to do is America has to get back, or the world has to get back to domestic production, because we tend to outsource things that need not be outsourced. The idea of what we call comparative advantage in economics, that's always necessary, because they're simply things that, let's say, our neighbor does much better than we do and at a better cost. Okay, so it behooves us then to focus on what we do best and get the other things from the neighbor. Comparative advantage, it was basically that, if you're good at hunting, or building huts, and the neighboring tribe is good at fishing, well, you're going to waste a lot of resources if you try to get good at fishing as well, and they'll waste a lot of resources they try to get good at building. So what you do is you trade with one another. You build their huts in exchange for fish. So you're both getting something out of it. They're getting huts built, you're getting fish, something, and so each of you are focusing on the thing you do best. That's called what we call comparative advantage in economics.
Yeah.
But today, and this trend really began in the 1970s, of outsourcing production in things that need not be outsourced.
Yeah.
We began with the oil industry, and as I mentioned before about OPEC financing the environmentalists to be anti-oil and the slowdown in domestic production. America actually used to produce nearly all of its domestic supply, but that began to dwindle almost to nothing by the end of the 1970s, and that was hurtful for the U.S. economy and economies in general, because they had to rely on foreign suppliers for something that they could get themselves.
Right.
So one of the things we started to do, we started to outsource things that we could actually do ourselves. England did it, America did it, various countries in Europe, everyone was doing this because they say it's creating a global economic community. Well, I'm all for economic trade, all for it completely, for free trade. What I am not for is killing local providers so that you can get it overseas, something that's completely unnecessary. And so we have to get back to, if America really wants to climb out of this, there are things that are sitting offshore on ships that could have been produced here in America. And why aren't they? It's because American policymakers have simply made it impossible to do. They've made it too expensive to do it.
Yeah.
So you have to get control of the apparatus of public policy, get it out of the hands of ambitious politicians, socialists, let me just put a fine point on it, get it out of their hands. Now, is it going to happen overnight? No. But we have to understand where this problem began. It's sort of like fighting cancer. It's all good, it's all fine to know that you have cancer, but it's much better to know where it came from, where it originated, and where the flare point is, because if it is possible to remove it, then you can remove it. Yeah. And so the problem is we often look at the results of policy or the results of a situation without thinking about how that situation began. And that's what I like. I like to look at the genesis. Let's see where this began. Because when we know how it began, we know how to address it now. We know how to deal with it.
Yeah.
And so, understanding what policymakers have done and how they're manipulating policy, we can correct it because we correct it at the source. Let's stop. Often what we do, and I'm talking about the political right, is when they come to power, their solutions are more palliative solutions. It's like, it isn't really solving a problem. It's a palliative. We're treating the results of the issue, not the cause. And so it's sort of like going to
the right is kind of like big pharma.
Yes, exactly.
Here's a pill.
Let's treat the symptoms. Forget about the cause. Let's just treat the symptoms. Let's make sure we keep you as a customer. And so I think what we need to start doing is getting away from palliative ways of addressing a problem and get more to root causes. And so it isn't going to happen overnight. I think that it is possible because there are a lot of people who are waking up slowly and a little too slowly for my taste, but they're waking up slowly to the problem.
Right.
But until we do more to educate them on how we got here, because this didn't start with COVID. This didn't start with the shutdown. The groundwork was laid for this years ago. Until we understand where the groundwork was laid, where the foundation was laid, we're going to repeat the same thing again. We're going to continue to repeat it and understand that every time they come to power, they move the goalpost a bit further. We have to get into the habit of moving it back.
There's a reason it's called the fourth industrial revolution. This isn't the first time around. So yeah, so the CUFID couldn't have had the effect that it had they didn't lay the groundwork and they hadn't put all of these into effect so long ago. All of it, all the policies, all of the social engineering and the conditioning. Yeah, all of that had to be laid in order for this to have had the effect that it had.
Right.
Yeah.
We look at electoral victories and that sort. I think that too many times people on the right will look at a judicial victory or an electoral victory and say, we won. And they get into this sort of euphoria that lasts a bit too long of celebrating a win. Many times we don't think that it might just be a Pyrrhic victory. So it might be actual loss that appears to be a win. It's a win that lulls us into a state of euphoria, of relaxation. And
right.
so we get to this point where we say, okay, the fight is over. That's why it's a Pyrrhic victory. It's a loss that appears to be a win.
Yeah.
Because it lulls us into inactivity. We need to understand that the other side has been actively doing this for more than 200 years. They have not stopped. They have lost a few times, they've retreated, they've slept a few times, but they never stopped. We always stop. Every victory, we think we've won, the fight is over. The fight is never over. When the Soviet Union collapsed, what did the political right do? It spent 10 years celebrating the fall of the Soviet Union, not realizing that the ideals of the Soviet Union were more powerful than ever. And why? Because you no longer had missiles pointed at you, so no one had to fear it anymore.
Yep.
So they can continue to preach that philosophy.
Well, and they could also, delegate it off to, more inconspicuous players.
Yes, exactly.
And so they could further their agenda without being known that they were furthering their agenda.
You mean Baptist bootlegging?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Right. Precisely. And the other thing I wanted to bring up when you were talking about like what's happening now with the markets and how people are responding to it. I think that you had mentioned before about the short term versus the long term. And I think when it comes to going local, I think that comes into play. I think that people are looking so immediately at, it's much cheaper if I buy something made in China. It might be cheaper to outsource my production in another country, but in the long run, that hurts my overall profit. That might hurt my overall control over my product, and all of those things are very important factors in my growth. And obviously the overall growth, not just the local growth, but because it trickles out, right? That's the economy really, Keynesian is all top down, but that we see that doesn't work. So what does work is bottom up, and bottom up only works grassroots. So I think that's
one of the things, and there again, it's about looking long term and short term. In economics, we have an expression, it's called the Law of Diminishing Returns.
Yeah.
And the Law of Diminishing Returns says that an idea that seems appealing at first, and it may actually work extremely well, but over time, it becomes a very bad idea.
Right.
Just over time. But initially, it may be a good idea. If you take a pain medication to get rid of your headache, let's say that pain medication is a narcotic. It gets rid of your headache. But what happens if you continue to take it habitually? Well, eventually your body naturally produces enzymes that cure pain. What this narcotic does is causes your body to overproduce it to cure pain immediately. So what happens when you take that narcotic too often is that your body it's hypertrophy. Your body forgets how to produce that enzyme. And so now the only way you can get it is through that narcotic.
Yep, it becomes
so
dependent.
Initially, it seemed like a great idea. Over time, it became a very, very bad idea. And that's what we do with public policy, particularly in economics. we take something, as you say, outsourcing could save us a few dollars. And it really does. I mean, things
Yes.
made in China are actually, are cheaper. But are they cheaper for a reason? Because over time, we begin to say that they could be less quality, even when they're better quality. Let's forget about the less quality, because that one is known. Everyone knows about that. But let's talk about things that may be is qualitatively comparative. Okay?
Mhm.
What you lose, and you just hit on it perfectly, is control. You give the other side control over your economy, because now, just like taking that narcotic, now the only way to get the thing is to get it from them,
Yep. You're
because
dependent.
you've now forgotten how to do it,
Yeah.
even if you have the resources. And the great thing, the interesting thing, we talk about natural resources or whatever. We
Yeah.
use that word so flagrantly, is that, we think, something is a resource because it exists. No, that isn't true.
Right.
A resource is
There
only
are
a
things that are
resource.
completely useless, actually.
A resource is only a resource if you know how to use it.
Right.
There was a time when oil was abundant throughout the world, but the only people who knew how to do anything or knew any uses for oil primarily were in the United States, Great Britain, and later on in Russia. The only people who really knew that oil had a value.
Yep.
There was a time in America where, swindlers would sell land to people, knowing that the land had oil on it. It was because that land couldn't. People bought land because they wanted to be, once used for farming, but that land had oil on it, and so the soil couldn't be tilled for farming, and so they were swindling them. And over time, those people became extremely wealthy once we realized the use of oil. They became very wealthy. So a resource is only an economic resource if you know how to use it.
Right.
If you don't know how to use it, then it's useless. And so that's the same thing when it comes to resources that sit in your own country, within your own borders.
Sure.
If you don't know how to use them, if you've forgotten how to use them, they're not really a resource anymore, are they?
No.
So now the only way you can get that thing you need is from that overseas dealer who's willing to give it to you in exchange for a little control.
Yep.
And that little control turns into a lot. And that is the danger. And so that word alone says it all. It's about control. And so if you really want to control it, you have to find a way to return to domestic production. And that doesn't have to be in everything. There again, I say comparative advantage. Do the things you do well.
Mm-hmm.
Outsource the things you don't.
Mm-hmm.
That's the way it should be.
And I think that's such I think that's so valuable to think about, not just in terms of going, local domestic production, but I think also in terms of, small production versus outsourcing to corporate.
That's right.
And, even the partnerships, because I think what we see sometimes, it's under the guise of looking really encouraging and promising, we see these big corporations coming in with, this offer of lots of money, lots of jobs, and I think people are deluded into thinking that in the immediate that could be a huge boom for the community. But what do they come with? First of all, most of these corporations have global agendas because they are global. So their interests are not going to be the interests of the community, the local community, or even the country, because they have global interests, because that's their roots. And then they're also, so those interests are going to have a controlling interest in whatever you're doing, because you no longer have the control. You've outsourced it. You're dependent upon them for whatever you've outsourced, whether it's financially or the production. I think that's something people really should keep in mind.
Of course. I mean, when we think of terms long-term and short-term, the attractiveness of outsourcing and going to corporations for things, that's very attractive because it can provide a short-term benefit, but there again, we need to look at the long-term effects.
Right.
In the short term, I will not argue with you that the effects could be immediate.
Yeah.
But over time, what are those effects going to be? Are we going to see diminishing returns? And I guarantee we do, because that's the way it works. It always has been that way, and it always will be, because nothing is good forever.
Right.
And so what you're doing, you're surrendering control to someone else. You know, I understand the benefit of saying, okay, there's a passage in the Bible where these men are preparing for battle. One of the Hebrew tribes are preparing for battle, and they said, one of them says, let's eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we shall die. And what they were thinking about was only the immediate. They were thinking about today. But what about tomorrow? What about the day after tomorrow? We have to think about the long term, because, we have generations after us who are going to inherit this world, hopefully. If
Hopefully. Yeah.
So we have to think about the impact on them. So when we think, that yes, I can reap some great short-term benefits here. It doesn't help us if it hurts us in the long run. And this is why socialism is so attractive to many people, because socialism always focuses on the here and now. It focuses on what you can get today. Someone once said, and I wish I could remember who it was, said that the problem for liberals, the liberal meaning conservatives. So I'm using the actual term of what liberal really is. Is that the problem for liberals is that, unlike socialists offer a beautiful dream, liberals are offering a bitter reality. And so we have to, and that's the problem with trying to sell our agenda, is that all we have is reality. The other side are able to package a nightmare as a beautiful dream.
Yeah, well, to me, nightmares aren't so beautiful, so I don't know about that, but
but they're able to sell it that way.
They are, and
that's the danger. So and so like I said, I understand why it is attractive to go with the short term, to say this is what I can get today. But if in the long term it makes us dependent, it makes us an addict, so to speak, like that, the drug, then are we really benefiting?
Yeah,
I'd say
no. No, I would definitely agree. And I think I would also add that, yes, a better reality that is comprised of flawed humans.
That's right.
That's so I think the socialists like to present that somehow humans can be perfectible. That we just need a policy to perfect human nature.
These are people who also believe that you can pass a law that can stop the climate from changing. I mean, once you accept that idea, you're pretty much lost in terms of intellectual ability. I mean, if you really believe you can pass a law to stop the climate from changing, then there is something truly wrong with you, and it isn't just an intellectual problem.
Yes. I was not aware that, this morning it was actually pretty chilly, and, then it got like warmer, and we just needed some sort of a policy that was going to rectify that so that it could be stagnant.
We can pass a law that'll keep it chilly for longer than necessary, so we can stop weather from happening.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. I wasn't aware that that's all we needed to do, but I'm so glad we have the socialists to tell us this. So environmentalists have made that known that that's all it's needed. So
just pass the right law. You can stop it from happening. You can stop climate change, whether you believe the climate is changing or not. There's evidence that goes either way. There is absolutely nothing you can do legislatively to prevent it. And I mean absolutely. I'm saying that, and it's an absolutist statement. You cannot do anything legislatively to prevent it.
That's not 100% true. I will add two caveats. One, we do know that the climate is changing. I mean, the climate goes through cycles, and the temperature does change.
Absolutely, it has to.
Last time I checked, I live in a place where there are seasons actually, and so the climate is always changing. But the climate just, we had ice ages, and we have, times of heat and fires, and so
Right.
yeah, there's absolutely climate change. But the other thing is they do have geoengineering, and this is not a conspiracy theory. This is a fact. It is in our congressional bills that there are geoengineering, components of our congressional bills, like chemtrails, for instance, are in the bills. So if they didn't exist, then I'm not really sure why there are, bills. And
well, let me clarify. When I say nothing you can do legislatively, mad scientists have always been mad scientists, and they will always find a way to do things. I mean, if you think that scientists are above, low morals and ethics, then you probably just Google the name Joseph Mengele.
we currently have reproducing robots, so I think that says it all, right?
So when I say nothing we can do legislatively to prevent climate change, that means that you can ban straws all day.
Yes.
You can ban fuel consumption, but you're not going to do anything legislatively, not talking about scientifically, to affect a change to affect a change in the climate. It cannot be done. No law you pass in London, in Moscow, in DC, or in Paris is going to change the temperature of the planet.
I'm with you. I agree. There are people who have been deluded to believe otherwise, but I'm in agreement with you.
Precisely. And that is the danger. That's the danger that we face economically. Because once you convince people that something is true, something that the empirical evidence alone tells them is not true,
right,
then you have won the propaganda war. We see people around the world right now who are absolutely convinced that something is true, that the evidence of their eyes and ears alone says otherwise.
Yes.
And that shows that the propaganda war has been won by one side of that argument.
Yes.
And that's why it's so difficult to get things moving on the correct economic front.
Yeah.
Because people make decisions based on their emotions, not cognitive rationality or reason.
Yeah. So
it feels good.
I'm sorry?
I said it's what feels good.
It's what feels good. Yeah. So speaking of the propaganda war, why do you think, I mean, we're almost 100 years later. Why do you think people believe the lies about the market crash in 1929?
Because it's been perpetuated through academia, through two sources, journalism and academia. And it's also been featured in many movies. And so people like to believe that, I don't listen to what other people say. But everything that the vast majority of the people know comes from the dominant information sources, and that is, or three, that is entertainment, journalism, and academia. And the problem is those three areas, and I'm not just in America, but around the world, are dominated by people who are embedded with a particular ideology, and that is the ideology of socialism. And so if everyone around you, all of these very intelligent, caring people are telling you the same story, then you almost sound like a tinfoil hat person by questioning it, right? I mean, you don't want to seem like an oddball. So you want to be a part of the group. And so why should you question it after all? All of these supposedly intelligent people are saying it. This is one of the problems, the things that began to open my eyes, because I was a leftist during my younger years. I was a kid in the 1980s, member of the Young People's Socialist League and that sort of thing. And while I didn't really like Reagan and Thatcher, I appreciated how they stood up to the Soviets, because there again, I was a Trotskyite, so I didn't like totalitarians. But I appreciated the fact that he stood up to the Soviets. Something really started to click with me because I began to see that a lot of the things that I was hearing about Reagan and Thatcher, and even, to a certain extent, of course, of Pinochet, were not just misrepresentations. They were not just things where two people can look at the same data and arrive at a different conclusion. No, they were outright lies. They were completely fabricating the stories.
Mm-hmm.
And when I started to see that, that's what made me question things that I had always been taught. I started to question the stories about the Great Depression, the stories about the Middle East, the stories about the Arab-Israeli conflict, the stories about World War II. I mean, all of these things. And the more I saw, when I developed this sort of rhythm that whenever everyone is saying the same thing in the same way,
Mm-hmm.
there's a good chance that it's propaganda. I'm being misled. Now, not always. I'm not saying it's always the case. But the vast majority of the time, when everyone is saying the same thing in the same way, that's when you have to question it. You
Yes.
have to be willing to be the outlier.
Absolutely. The meta narrative, Leotard.
Yeah.
He was a postmodernist. He coined the meta narrative, which is essentially that. It's the agreed upon consensus that is being promulgated. And I don't think it's any coincidence we're now in the age of the metaverse. Yeah.
Of course, and that's the reason why I question these things. That's the reason why I stand on the outside and say, let's look at this with fresh eyes. Because if you're not doing that, then you're just accepting propaganda. And the reason it's become so dominant is because it comes from the sources, from the primary sources of information that most people have: entertainment, journalism, academia. And I would actually, people don't have the time nor the willingness to do their own research, so you rely on what you hear.
Yeah, right. And I would actually add that a lot of the religious institutions now too.
Oh, too many.
Yeah.
They become. I'm actually alarmed at how many. I mean, I always knew that religious institutions had been co-opted by the left. Yeah. I'm alarmed at how many and how ubiquitous it is, because you would have thought that there would be religious institutions standing up to these things, and yet they seem to be marching in lockstep with it. Yeah, and that is very sad when you see that. Yeah. It is a very frightening thing when the people who are supposed to be the sort of safeguards of morality and ethics have completely abandoned it in favor of conformity. And we're in the age of absolute conformity in all things. Conform or die.
Literally conform or die. Yeah. My story of being at the eye doctor with the the masks and the 3 security guards circling me. I almost, if I weren't so horrified in the moment, I would have thought that it couldn't be real. Right. Literally, they're surrounding me and they're just chanting. It was like a chant: comply, comply, comply. And that's what we're living in. Comply.
And that's why when you see law enforcement agencies and militaries willingly do these things, we're seeing a repeat of the sort of history that we fought against. We lost millions of lives trying to prevent these things from ever happening again, and we're seeing a repeat of it. Mm-hmm. And that is the problem. Nothing is worse than a tyrant who believes they're actually doing something good. Yeah. I can live with the real demons. It's the demons who believe themselves to be angels of mercy and ministers of righteousness. Those are the ones that are truly dangerous, because they really believe they're doing something good. And law enforcement and government and military and all of these people, when they use that power to achieve the worst of things. The Nuremberg trials, if they did nothing else, they established one principle, and that is doing my job is not a defense. Because you have a higher responsibility. You have a responsibility to refuse to follow an order that is contrary to humanity. Yep. That is contrary to conscience. You have a duty to refuse. Absolutely. And so these war criminals who were on trial in Nuremberg, their biggest defense was, I was doing what I was ordered to do. Well, we established that that is not a defense.
Nope.
Following my orders is not a defense. So when those security guards surrounded you and did that, they were following orders, sure.
Mm-hmm.
But that is not a defense.
No, not at all. And when you say that these people who they've been deceived is really what it is. They think that they're serving something good. And I say that they serve a trinity, and it's deception, division, and destruction. And I think that really is the trinity of the left. It's, they have to deceive, they have to delude people to thinking that they're doing something good. That's the whole premise behind critical theory and now critical race theory, right? They convince these people that they're doing something really good because we have to fight this evil, when really they're, it's inversion tactics. What they're doing is evil. And then the division, because they can't win without dividing and conquer. They need to create this division, everybody fighting against each other, so they implode themselves, and then they can usurp the power. And then, of course, they clean it up by destroying everything, and then you have the complete chaos, which they will so graciously come in and bring the order in the form of tyranny. Yeah. So. Yeah, for sure. That is not what we need. So we need to fight against this. So we need to, well, what are your suggestions fighting against it? You were talking about local.
Well, one of it is economically, that is getting back to local production. Not just within your own borders, but local when it can be even more local than that in your community. But also people have to understand that you have to wrest control and take public policy away from ambitious politicians. Mm-hmm. There has to be a strict line of demarcation, and this, we have to be able to say, these are the things that you may not legislate. You may not govern in these areas. Mm-hmm. But that's going to take time, honestly. People have to become more involved, because we've seen what complying has done. They say comply and you'll be free. Well, that's not freedom at all. I mean, if you comply and you get a little freedom, that's how prisons work.
Yeah.
That's not how free societies work. You do what we say and you'll get freedom. No, freedom is an absolute that exists before you. And so people have to understand that no matter how much they comply with a tyrannical policy, it only increases the strength of the tyrant. And so at some point, you have to be willing to say, no, this is where it ends. The woman who lives with the abusive man who beats her all the time, but she stays because he's made her afraid of that dangerous world out there. You'll have no home, you'll have no one feeding you, no one clothing you, no one protecting you. So you may as well deal with my abuse, because the abuse you'll suffer out there is far worse. Right. Eventually, that woman has to be able to say, no more. Exactly. I will take my risks on my own. And this is where we've become with society. Society has become the abused wife.
Yeah, and they become so risk averse.
My tormentor cares about me much more than the evil outside world. So I'll just suffer through the torment. Yeah. And people have to get away from that mentality.
Right. And people have to.
Of the safety net it has become the prison.
Yeah, and people really do need to become less risk averse. People have become so risk averse that the irony is they're risking everything.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's the best way to put it. They're so risk averse that they're actually risking more.
Everything. And our founding fathers are such a great example of that, because they knew that they had everything to lose. These were not people who were, on their last, their last hope and their last penny, their last anything, but they felt that freedom was worth more. And they had nothing, and their future generations, the posterity, had nothing without freedom. And so they were willing to take that risk and fight for that. So They should be the examples who pave the way for everybody to know. But yeah, so when you talk about, the economic freedoms, because I think my concern really is that there is such a rigging of the markets. So I think in one way that is kind of a protection. I don't think they'll completely let it fall because it behooves them to have that system in place. But on the other hand, it means we are somewhat at the mercy of, the whims that they implement, to serve their agendas. So I'm curious about what we can do to safeguard.
Well, there again, it's public policy that got you into this problem. It's public policy that will get you out. But you need to be, the people that you put into those positions have to be willing to get there to get rid of power, not to use it.
Right, because it's all intertwined. The markets are tied to. I'm sorry, say that.
People go into political office and they want to use power.
Right.
You need people who go into political office to obliterate the power.
So, and I think the connection too is that because you had laid this out before, but it's the policies that allow for the markets to be controlled the way they're controlled. Right. Even on the global stage. But if we can change that through our local and federal policies, that will, turn things back over to the people. I have a friend who says, all of our problems can be rectified with with the signing of a pen, with like basically a signature. and I always kind of marvel at this statement. I'm like, but there's a lot of truth to it, actually. So many of our problems have been created with the proverbial pen, but essentially, and they can be overturned just as easily. So
at some point, it almost feels as if we've actually crossed the Rubicon. There's no turning back. But I do believe that if things can flow in one direction, it can also obviously go the other way. And, we've only reached the point of no return when we agree to it.
When we what?
When we agree to it. So, this idea of having reached the point of no return is only possible if you've accepted it.
Yeah. And so many people have, but so many more people are waking up, and the Great Awakening will combat the Great Reset.
That's right.
I hope we witness that, but I do believe that. I believe that it absolutely will. And so many people are waking up to it. And, thanks to people like you who are shining light on historical events and helping us to understand why they're so relevant. So today,
thanks for you for having it.
What?
I said, and thanks for you for having it.
Thank you. Yeah. So if you have any closing, I think that's a great place to leave us. So tell us if you have anything else you want to leave us with, and obviously where to find you and find your books and all that good stuff.
You can find Queer Sinister Things, which is a statement on U.S., British, and Soviet policies in the Middle East, primarily in Iran. You can find it on Amazon. You can find it at Barnes & Nobles and other retailers. And of course, I definitely want to thank Courtenay for having this platform available. We need to keep illuminating the facts of history, the facts of the present and the past. The problem that people manipulate, not just markets, but they manipulate information, manipulate history. And I've said in my book that when we bastardize history, then future generations will inevitably suffer from a past that never existed. And that is the danger.
Yeah, that is absolutely the danger. And that is so well said. Yes, we need to make sure that the people who are rewriting history do not have the loudest voice. So, yeah.
And the only voice.
Currently, yeah. Well, they're not the only voice, but currently they're the predominant voice. So yes. we will ensure they're not the only voice. So yeah, we'll keep shining light on the truth. because the truth always matters. So, all right. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Courtenay.